Harbor of Embers. At 11:47 at night, Darius Cole stood on the deck of a salvage barge at the edge of Baltimore Harbor with a diver's floodlight in one hand and his phone recording in the other. Below him, brought up out of 30 feet of black water an hour before, lay the wreck of a sunken tug. And inside its flooded wheelhouse, still bolted to the bulkhead, was an old brass clock, its hand stopped forever at 17 minutes past 2. 2 is 17. That was the whole of it. A stop clock green with corrosion pulled from a boat that everyone had already agreed went down by accident. The deck around him had gone still for the wrong reason. Not the quiet of a crew resting after a hard lift, but the stillness of men who had just decided all at once to stop talking and watch what the captain would do next. Across the deck, under the work lights, Conrad Voss smiled. Voss was a waterfront developer, the kind of man who bought influence one permit at a time, who could make a harbor commission see things his way over a long enough lunch. He had come down to the water himself tonight, which was unusual, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he believes the ending has already been written, notarized, and filed. In his hand, Voss held a preliminary incident report. He was about to sign the one that would call the tug sinking an accident and close the matter before sunrise. Darius looked at the clock. He looked at the tide chart clipped to the rail. He looked at Voss. "Don't touch that," Darius said. "The clock is lying. Nobody on that deck expected the sentence." And in less than an hour, the tide would turn. A surge was coming that would carry the toxins pooling around the wreck straight into a protected estuary, into the nurseries where half the bay's life began unless the evidence was recovered and the source sealed before dawn. The only person in the whole city willing to believe him had not arrived yet. Her name was Maya Linford. She was an environmental litigator, and before this night was over, she would matter to Darius more than any wreck ever could. This is the story of a clock stopped at the wrong time and what it cost the man who refused to let the water carry the truth away. Part 1. The detail nobody wanted. Darius Cole was a black single father and a licensed marine salvage captain, and he had learned the first rule of his work in cold water years before anyone handed him a captain's license. The rule was simple, and it was the same on the water as it was anywhere the truth could be lost to a careless hand. Panic destroys evidence faster than fire, faster than water, faster than any lawyer who ever billed by the hour. When a boat goes down, the instinct of everyone on the surface is to move fast. Pump it out. Write it. Haul it to a yard and start the insurance paperwork before the coffee gets cold. And every one of those instincts washes away a little more of the truth because the sea is the most patient destroyer of evidence there is. What the fire does not burn, the water dissolves. What the water spares, the current carries off. So Darius did not rush. He never did. It was the thing that made impatient men call him slow, and it was the thing that made him impossible to discredit later. The detail had begun as almost nothing. A brass clock stopped at 2:17 pulled from the wheelhouse of a tug that the paperwork said had gone down at 3:45 in the morning. Hours later, when a crew was supposedly aboard fighting a fire they could not contain. But a mechanical clock like that one does not stop when a boat sinks. It stops when the water reaches it. And 2:17 was long before anyone claimed the trouble had even begun. Darius did not call it proof. Professionals earned the right to use that word slowly. He called it a question. He photographed it from 3 angles in place before anything was moved. He noted the exact time of recovery. Then he did the thing that separated him from men who trusted their own memory too much. He asked a deckhand named Ruiz, a steady man with no stake in the outcome and no reason to lie for him or against him, to stand and witness the whole collection, and he wrote down Ruiz's name. A witness to the recovery is worth more than the thing recovered. To the men waiting to close out the night, this looked like caution bordering on stubbornness. A salvage job has a clock of its own. It has tides and overtime and an owner who wants his slip cleared. Every minute Darius spent photographing a corroded timepiece was a minute the whole crew stood idle in the cold. But Darius had spent his life in diving operations, in incident command, in reading vessel logs, the way other men read newspapers, and above all in reading currents like a language, knowing where the water would carry a thing and where it would leave it behind. And what all of that told him looking at those frozen hands was that the pattern was too sharp to ignore. If the clock stopped at 2:17, the boat took on water at 2:17. And if the boat took on water 2 hours before the fire was ever reported, then the fire had not sunk the tug. Something else had opened her up first quietly in the dark, and the fire had come later to cover it. He preserved the clock exactly as found. He logged a working record with photographs and measurements, and on a fresh page he wrote down every hand that had touched the wreck since it broke the surface. That last step is the one nobody applauds. It is also the one that holds. He checked the assumption twice. Then he asked the only question that ever mattered. Who benefits if I'm wrong? The first person to oppose him was not Conrad Voss. Voss was too smart to be first. The first was a yard manager named Hollis, a tired, decent man who did not want to be a villain and did not want to be a hero, who wanted only for this one night to stay ordinary so he could send the crew home and lock the gate. "Old clock like that could have stopped years ago," Hollis said. "Rust salt, who knows? You're going to hang a whole investigation on a piece of junk that quit before the boat ever left the dock." Darius understood the temptation better than Hollis knew. He had a daughter asleep at home. He had a mortgage on a small house near the water and a business that lived and died on the goodwill of the same men who signed Voss's permits. And he had a reputation built over 20 years in cold water that could be sunk by a single rumor that Cole saw sabotage in every wreck. "If it stopped years ago," Darius said, "the movement will be dry frozen, seas solid. If it stopped tonight, it'll still turn. Let's open the case and look." When they opened the case, the movement was not dry frozen. It had stopped clean the way a running clock stops when cold water floods it all at once. It had been keeping time right up until the moment the harbor came pouring in. And Hollis went quiet because somewhere under his tiredness he had suspected it too. He just hadn't wanted to be the man who said it out loud. Darius rebuilt the sequence of the sinking minute by minute. He left blanks where a lesser investigator would have invented a bridge, because a false bridge is exactly how the guilty swim free. They wait for you to guess, then prove your guess wrong, and once one claim sinks, everyone forgets the 10 that floated. He documented the whole exchange before emotion could revise it. Credibility, he knew, is built in the details nobody claps for. Maya Linford arrived without a dramatic entrance. That was the first thing Darius noticed about her, and it was not a small thing. Lawyers, in his experience, came down to the docks like they were doing the water a favor. She simply walked out onto the barge in sensible boots, listened for a full minute before she spoke, and then asked him the two questions that set her apart from everyone else on the harbor. "What do you know?" she said. "And what do you only suspect? Give me both. Don't let them touch." Most people wanted Darius to be certain because certainty is comforting and it fills a headline. Maya wanted him accurate, which is harder and rarer, and she made him answer both questions out loud until the line between fact and instinct was clean enough to carry into a courtroom. She was an environmental litigator, and her calm hid a ferocious moral center that had ended more than one polluter's easy afternoon. Beneath the measured voice was someone who had watched too many rivers die by the quiet arithmetic of men like Voss and had decided a long time ago to be expensive to them. She was beautiful in the way confidence becomes beautiful over time. Direct eyes, a steady voice, an intelligence that refused to be flattered into carelessness. Her restraint pulled at Darius before either of them would admit it. But that was later. That night, she was simply the first person who understood what a stop clock could mean. "If you're right," she said quietly, "then that tug didn't burn and sink. It was opened and then set on fire to hide the hole." "I know," Darius said. "Then we do this carefully," she said, "or we don't do it at all, because careless is how the tide takes your evidence and your case with it." By morning, Conrad Voss had an explanation. It was a good one. Neat enough to comfort a harbor commission, smooth enough to satisfy a local reporter, clean enough that anyone who had not looked closely would nod and move on. A tragic accident, an old boat, a fire in the night, nobody's fault. The explanation accounted for everything except timing. And timing on the water, as in every system, was where the lie confessed. Voss's story required the tug to have flooded at 3:45 during the fire. But the clock said 2:17 and the tide chart said something worse. At 2:17, the water had been slack and low. A boat does not quietly take on that much water at slack tide unless someone helps it. The timeline only worked if a hull had been opened on purpose in the calm hours, then torched later to blame the flames. Darius did not accuse anyone. He simply laid the three things side by side: the clock, the tide chart, the incident report, and let the gaps between them speak. Voss studied those gaps for a long moment. Then his smile changed the way a man's smile changes when he decides to stop being charming and start being something colder. "You do good work, Captain," Voss said. "Everybody says so, which is why it'd be a shame to see people start asking whether you damaged that clock yourself pulling it up too fast. Salvage is rough on old equipment. Things break, stories get complicated." "They do," Darius said. "So let's keep this one simple." And the tide for now was still hours from turning. Part 2. The pressure changes shape. Retaliation from powerful people rarely announces itself. It does not kick down your door. It comes ashore dressed as concern. First came a consultant hired that same week who suggested gently that Darius might want to step aside from this particular salvage, not because he'd done anything wrong, simply because he was so close to it now and objectivity mattered so much, and wouldn't everyone rest easier if a neutral outfit finished the job? Then came an old friend, a tug captain Darius had known since they were both deckhands, who took him aside on the pier and lowered his voice. "Men like Voss don't threaten you," his friend said. They just make sure the permits stop coming and the referrals dry up, and one day you realize you haven't had a contract in 6 months and you can't prove why, and the whole time they'll smile and say the market's just soft. And then 3 nights later, the message arrived. No name attached, just a line of text on Darius's personal phone, a number he had never handed out. Stop asking questions or lose the career you built. Darius read it twice. Then he did the thing that disappointed everyone betting on his fear. He did not delete it and he did not answer it. He saved it, photographed it, backed it up, and reported it through every proper channel, turning a private threat into a public record. He refused to make it a duel. A duel is what they wanted because a duel has 2 men in it and a duel can be lost. A record has no opponent. A record just waits. The decision cost him. It cost him sleep first, and then it cost him work as clients who valued comfort over loyalty found quiet reasons to hire a less complicated captain. It cost him the easy company of men who had once shared his thermos on cold mornings. Some days he came home so tired he sat in his truck in the driveway a while before he could go in and pretend the tide was still with him. His daughter, whose name was Tasha, was 10 and far too observant, the kind of child who read a man's face the way her father read the water. She would look up from the kitchen table and study him. Bad day on the water. Long one, he'd say. Not bad, long. She would nod as if she believed him, and then some evenings she would quietly push half her dinner across the table toward him and say she was full. She had seen him skip meals in the lean months. She knew exactly what the lean months looked like. And every time she did it, Darius had to turn toward the sink so she would not see his face. That was the real cost, not the contracts. Half a plate of dinner from a child who understood too much. One night, through the dark of her doorway, Tasha asked him if they were going to have to sell the house by the water. We're not selling the house, he said. You promise? I promise, he said. That's my job. Yours is to sleep and to trust that your old man knows how to keep a boat afloat. He wasn't certain it was true when he said it, but he had decided, standing in that doorway, that he would rather make it true than make it easy. Some promises you keep by refusing to break them one impossible day at a time. A witness appeared. His story was too convenient to trust, and it arrived too easily the way flotsam arrives on a tide that somebody arranged. He was a young yard worker who claimed he'd seen Darius mishandle the wreck, drop the clock damage, the evidence, jump to conclusions to make a name for himself. It was the kind of testimony that, if believed, would end the investigation and Darius's license in the same afternoon. The man who'd found the truth would become the man who'd faked it. Darius did not humiliate him. That was the mistake the young man's handlers were hoping for: an angry captain bullying a nervous kid. A scene that would look terrible in a hearing. Instead, Darius tested the account the way he tested everything. Against records. Against tide logs. Against the simple human fact that fear makes memory uneven and rehearsed. Lies come out too smooth. The young man's story was too smooth. It ran in a straight line, start to finish, no hesitations, no corrections. None of the small confusions that live inside real memory. Real memory stumbles. It doubles back. This account had been walked many times before it was ever spoken aloud. Darius let him finish. He did not interrupt. Then he asked one quiet question the young man had not been prepared for, about where he'd supposedly been standing when the clock was recovered, and pointed out gently that the spot he named had been under water at that hour. The tide had covered it. No one could have stood there. The straight line broke. The young man opened his mouth and nothing came out. Somebody scared you, Darius said. It was not an accusation. It was almost kind. I'm not going to add to it. But understand something. The people who wrote that story for you will not be standing next to you when the water goes out. They never are. Behind the young man's fear was pressure, and behind the pressure was a shape far larger than a single sunken tug. It pointed toward a pattern of deliberate barge fires set to contaminate a stretch of harbor parcels so badly that the owners would have no choice but to sell cheap and fast to the one buyer patient enough to be waiting. Poison the ground, then buy it for pennies. A whole neighborhood of working docks burned into a bargain. Darius did not celebrate. He documented, and he moved carefully closer to the center. And the closer he came, the more human wreckage he saw scattered around it. Dock workers who had been told to keep quiet. A boat owner who had been blamed for a fire he never said his livelihood ruined so that the truth would have somewhere to sink. Anger is useful, Maya told him one night over 2 cups of coffee neither of them drank. It shows you where the motive lives. It will never replace proof. Stay angry if you have to. Just don't let it into the record. Part 3. The Offer and the Vanishing. Conrad Voss finally spoke to Darius directly. The tone was civilized, almost generous. They met in Voss's office, above the water, all glass and clean lines, with a model of the future harbor glowing on a table, a harbor with no working docks left in it. Voss talked about the future the way a man talks about land he already owns. There would be contracts. Every salvage and dredging job in the new development steered Darius's way. There would be a retainer larger than anything he'd earned in his best year, and beyond all of it, there would be peace. No more silent phones. No more dead seasons. A life free of friction laid out like a chart with the course already drawn. Darius heard the insult folded inside the generosity. The offer assumed that a man who had survived hard water could be bought with calm seas. It assumed his integrity was just a price nobody had met yet. He declined without a speech. He had learned that a speech gives your opponent something to answer. Silence gives them nothing. Later, alone in his truck, Darius let himself feel how close the temptation had actually come. Not because he wanted the retainer, because he had a daughter and the work Voss dangled would have meant she never pushed half a plate across a table again. That was the real bribe. Not his comfort, hers. He thought about the estuary, the nurseries where the bay's life began, the poison waiting on the turning tide. He thought about the boat owner blamed for a fire he didn't set. He thought about the version of himself that would take the money and become quietly one more man who had read the water right and looked away. Tasha would only know the good years if he took it. That was the terrible part. She would never learn they had been bought with a poisoned harbor and other men's ruin. But he would know, and a father who lies to himself cannot teach a daughter the truth. So he started the truck and drove home, and he did not take the money. Then the evidence disappeared. The clock was gone from the locked evidence cage at the yard. A storage container that should have been sealed was found standing open, and within a day, someone had turned that loss into an accusation, whispering that Darius Cole was careless with recovered property, that he could not be trusted, that perhaps he had gotten rid of the clock himself because it never said what he claimed. The setback worked because it held a grain of truth. Darius had trusted a system. He had assumed a locked cage was locked, that a chain of custody would be honored, that the rules protected the facts. But the system had never been built to protect inconvenient facts. It had been built to protect the men who paid for the Harbor Commission's long lunches. He did not fall apart. He and Maya simply began again, this time from sources no one could reach and steal. The 3 photographs from 3 angles, time-stamped, already backed up off-site the first night. The tide chart's a matter of public record. Ruiz, the deckhand, who had watched the recovery with his own eyes. The small, stubborn witnesses left behind by ordinary work, the ones people forget to erase because they never think of them as evidence at all. They took the clock, Maya said, so we prove it from the water and the witnesses. The tide keeps better records than any man, and it can't be bought. Part 4. What the records say. The legal path mattered more than Darius wanted it to. Maya walked him through it line by line. What could be entered and what could not. What needed a subpoena before it meant anything. What order the evidence had to arrive in and which agency had to be told first, because the truth revealed the wrong way could be ruled unusable no matter how true it was. Darius hated the delay. Every day they waited was a day another barge might burn, another parcel might poison another owner, might be pressured into signing. But then he understood what the patience was for. If they cut corners, Voss would not lose. The evidence would simply be thrown out and he would walk away cleaner than before, shielded by the very proof that should have condemned him. So their patience became a strategy, and the strategy became a promise they made out loud, so neither could pretend later they hadn't agreed. No shortcuts, no manufactured heroics. No innocent person sacrificed for a cleaner ending. It was, Darius would think later, the moment he stopped working beside Maya Linford and started trusting her. Their trust never announced itself either. It grew in small practical gestures. A coffee left untouched until the chain of custody was complete. A hand placed briefly over a shaking wrist after a hearing that went badly. A decision to tell the truth in a room even when the truth made them both look uncertain, because looking certain and being honest are not the same thing. And she had taught him which one to choose. The immediate danger arrived the way real danger usually does. Not with a warning, with a tide. The night the case turned, the harbor turned with it. A surge was building, the biggest of the season, and the toxins pooled around the wreck site, and the latest burned barge were about to be lifted and carried straight into the protected estuary. If that happened before the source was sealed and sampled, the poison would spread beyond any hope of tracing, and the crime would dissolve into the whole bay, everywhere and nowhere, impossible to pin to any single fire. Darius understood the full design now, and it was worse than arson. The deliberate fires, the contaminated parcels, the owners pressured into cheap sales, and now the tide itself timed and used as a weapon to erase the evidence and spread the harm so wide that no one could ever prove it began with a match in Conrad Voss's harbor. They were not hiding one crime. They were letting the sea hide it inside a disaster. It was the kind of plan that only made sense to a man who had stopped counting the water as alive. It never called itself poison. It called itself development. When the moment came, Darius did exactly what 20 years on the water had trained him to do. He did not improvise. He ran it as an incident command by the book, coordinating with the proper agency, logging every action, keeping the chain intact so that nothing he did could later be dismissed as a rogue captain overstepping. The operation moved fast but not carelessly. They contained the source, took the samples, and sealed the site ahead of the surge. Every decision that night was built to survive review. And in the middle of it, the clock stopped at 2:17, finally paid off. That first small detail, the one Hollis had called a piece of junk, the one that had cost Darius his sleep and his contracts and nearly his license, that detail unlocked everything. The true time of the sinking, the impossible tide, the hull opened in the calm hours and torched to hide the hole. And the man who had believed right up until that night that the water would keep his secret forever. Part 5. The truth has a price. The reckoning did not happen in a dark alley, and it did not happen with raised voices. It happened where accountability actually belongs. Before investigators, before counsel, before an environmental authority and people required by law to answer precise questions under oath. Conrad Voss tried charm first. When charm found nothing to hold, he tried outrage, the wounded fury of an important man insulted by a lesser one. And when outrage failed, he tried one last betrayal, turning on the contractors and middlemen who had lit his fires in the hope that giving them up would spare him the deepest fall. Each move failed for the same reason. Darius had built a case, not a legend. He had no single devastating flourish, no thunderclap line. He had something far more dangerous to a man like Voss. He had timestamped photographs of the clock, public tie charts that made the official story physically impossible, water samples with a chemical fingerprint that matched the barge fires, and independent witnesses whose accounts had been tested until they held. At one point, Voss looked directly at Darius across the room, and for the first time, there was no charm in his face at all. Just a cold curiosity, the look of a man studying something he does not understand. "You could have had every job on this waterfront," Voss said low enough that only Darius could hear. "Why throw it away for a patch of mud and people who'll never even know your name?" And Darius, who had asked himself that same question in a dark truck and in a doorway and through many sleepless months, gave him the answer simply. "Because I'd know," he said. "That was always going to be enough." When the full shape of the scheme finally emerged, the fires, the poison parcels, the pressured sails, the tide meant to wash it all away. Everyone in that room understood at last why every earlier inconvenience had mattered. Why Darius had photographed a corroded clock from 3 angles. Why he had written down every hand that touched the wreck. Why he had refused to guess, refused the money, refused to turn a threat into a duel. Conrad Voss did not fall because a crowd demanded it. Crowds are fickle, and men like Voss had ridden out worse. He fell because decisions leave records even beneath the water, especially beneath the water, and records eventually meet someone patient enough to read them. The consequence was lawful and quiet and complete. An emergency environmental order sealing the contaminated sites. A chain of custody preserved so carefully no lawyer could break it. Sworn testimony that opened the whole scheme to the daylight it had been built to avoid. The estuary was spared, the nurseries survived the season, and the working docks Voss had meant to burn into a bargain stayed in the hands of the families who ran them. Darius was offered praise he had not sought. He accepted only the part that belonged to the people who had stood with him when standing with him was dangerous. Ruiz, who had witnessed a recovery at midnight. The boat owner, whose name was cleared and whose livelihood was restored. Even the young yard worker who had chosen in the end to correct his lie rather than live inside it. Part 6. After the noise. In the quiet that came afterward, Darius Cole and Maya Linford finally met with no case file between them. Neither of them pretended that danger had created what was between them. Danger does not create character. It only reveals it. And over the long months of the fight, each of them had seen exactly who the other was under pressure, which is the only version of a person that ever really matters. So they chose a slower beginning on purpose. Dinner after the last hearing with no evidence to discuss. A walk along a pier that was still, thanks to them, a working pier. Messages that did not require an emergency. Room deliberately made for trust to become something durable rather than something forged in a single crisis and cracked by the first calm week. Darius was still a single father, still careful with the private parts of his life, still the kind of man who wrote things down and checked the tide twice. That did not change, but something else did. For years he had believed survival was the most he could hope for. Get through the season, make the mortgage, pack the lunch, keep his daughter safe, and ask the water for nothing more. Standing on that pier in the ordinary evening with Maya beside him and one of Tasha's drawings folded in his jacket, he understood that survival and peace were not the same thing. He had been so good at the first that he had stopped believing he was allowed the second. This time, he allowed himself both. Months later, the public record had settled into its final shape. The contaminated parcels were cleaned. The fraudulent sales were unwound. The people who had been blamed for other men's fires had their names returned to them, which makes a smaller headline than a scandal and matters a great deal more. Darius went back to work with the same discipline that had saved him. Observe, verify, document, act. He did not grow reckless with success because he had watched what recklessness did to Conrad Voss, and he had no intention of becoming a quieter version of the man he'd brought down. Maya walked beside him now, not as a prize for surviving a scheme, as a partner who had chosen the truth back when the truth was expensive, which is the only time the choice ever counts. The harbor kept moving tide after tide, indifferent and enormous, full of people who would never know how close the whole estuary had come to poison in the space of one turning night. And somewhere beneath all that moving water, the truth Darius Cole had fought to protect remained exactly where he had put it. In the light. And on the record, because in the end, that was the whole of his work and the whole of the man. Not the salvage, not the rescue. Just a stubborn refusal to let a lie sink out of sight from someone who understood that the smallest act of courage, a clock photographed a tide chart, read an offer declined at midnight, can save more than the world will ever pause to see. End.